Norway in a word. Not Vikings?
No.
No Vikings.
Breathtaking.
Breathtaking. Well, that beats Vikings. Okay, I'm going to go with you on that.
Viking villages too. But
And what?
Viking villages.
Viking villages. Wow. And what was that like?
Touristy.
Quirky?
Touristy.
Oh, touristy. I should have been able to guess that, yes. Well, we're glad you guys are back. There was a fella in Mexico who was on his deathbed. He was could die at any moment. But he smelled his wife in the kitchen making tamales, the aroma of tamales. He loved the tamales she made. And he lay there in bed, and he just could not resist. He was able to somehow prop himself up on the edge of the bed in his frail predicament, and he sat up on the edge of the bed, and he got his walker, and he pulled himself up, and he slowly made his way out of the bedroom and down the hallway towards the kitchen. And with each step, it seemed like the aroma of those tamales were just calling him forward. And he finally was able to get into the kitchen, and he walked over next to where she was, and he reached down to take a tamale. And the next thing he knew, she had taken a wooden spatula and banged him on the back of the head and said, "Don't eat those. Those are for your funeral." Now, when I heard that, I thought, now there's a woman who's committed to the idea of control. She's going to control her world down to the smallest little thing she can. I love that story. I don't know if he ended up getting a tamale or not. He probably just turned around and went back to bed like, of course, kind of thing. Well, we are doing a series called Rerouting God's Back Roads to Joy. Happiness is not the same as joy. Happiness can come and happiness can go. Happiness is mostly dependent on circumstances. But joy is a very different animal. And it requires something of knowing God and living in this world to experience joy. But it does not come intuitive to any of us. For us to learn joy usually involves some type of hardship. And I like what C.S. Lewis said, that the long story of God in our lives is to bring us to a place where we experience ultimate joy, which will be in heaven. But along the way, we are learning different aspects of what joy is. And we are in number 4 today, and today the message is called Glad Surrender. It's the loss of control, which is, again, so unintuitive to us as people. We think that joy has to do with control and controlling our world and controlling our relationships and controlling getting what we want. And in actuality, control ultimately with other people and the people in my life and my circumstances more has to do with creating misery and hardship than it does joy. And so some of the things that God has to do are hard times. Well, a little bit of a review. We look at week 1. Joy is, one sense of joy is certainty. And certainty is that sense down in your gut that my life is in God's hands and He's telling a story with me. And no matter what my circumstances look like at any given moment of time, I'm on the right path. God has control of the situation. And that certainty provides a level of joy that's really down more in the gut than it is in your heart. But it starts in the gut and begins to make its way up. The second kind of joy we looked at is hunger. Mark spoke about this a few weeks ago. We have deeper desires for God and to be used by God in the lives of other people that provide significance and meaning. But for the most part, that is not intuitive to us at all. And so in order to break through a level in our heart that goes down to those deeper desires and make us more aware of those, it requires our lesser desires to not be met. This is very unintuitive to us as people, but when our longings are not met, then it forces us to drive down deeper into our hearts and become aware of deeper desires to want to know God and to please God, to love God and to be used by Him in the lives of other people. But again, this doesn't just happen because we're Christians. It usually happens because we're kicking and screaming when our lesser desires, our longings are not met. And then last week we looked at the joy of belovedness. And in spite of who we are, and in spite of our past, and in spite of our mistakes and our sin, our selfishness, our ugliness. In spite of all of that, we are fully known by God and yet still fully wanted. That's a different kind of joy. A different kind of joy. And so the reroutes that we've looked at, there are three. The first one is shattered dreams. The second one is unmet longings. And last week we looked at brokenness. All of these are times in our life where God sort of crashes into our life with one of these three things and says, rerouting, rerouting. And here we're off. Instead of the freeway to our happiness, we're on some back road that God is leading us to. And today we're looking at joy number 4, which is glad surrender. We surrender to God, we surrender control to Him, but we do so gladly. At first, we do so with great trepidation, but God teaches us to do this gladly. And the back road to this kind of experience of joy is the loss of control. Loss of control. About 6 weeks ago, we celebrated Mother's Day, which is a good thing. We enjoy doing that. And yet all of you mothers know that being a mother is more complicated than when you were young. And that it involves a lot of sacrifice and a lot of pain. There are elements of the first few months where you may experience a lack of sleep and tiredness that you never knew. And you get into those teen years, and sometimes those are very, very challenging to provide pain. And yet God uses these things in our lives to awaken us here to our loss of control. I'd like to look at the life of Hannah in just a moment. But before we do, I'd like to describe a little bit more what kind of pain do women go through. It's not that men don't go through this as well, but you ladies really feel this a lot more deeply than we do generally. But after Adam and Eve sinned, God came and spoke to Adam about the different world he was going to live in, and to Eve, the different world she was going to live in. And that's the part I'd like us to focus on this morning. Genesis 3:16. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain, you will give birth to children. Now, it's easy to sort of, in the English, to look at, is God just saying the same thing, just slightly differently 2 times? And the answer is no. He is saying one thing, and he is illustrating it by one thing. Now, what the first one is, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. And here we use the word childbearing usually with labor and delivery room. But this word means the bearing of children all through their growing up years and into adulthood. There's going to be pain here in your relationships. Do not be surprised by that with people who are closest to you. And then he says, with pain, you will give birth to children. And what he's saying here is, I'm going to remind you of this very thing in the labor and delivery room. That even though this is a time of great joy in giving birth to a child, it's also going to be a place of pain during the course of your time. God is going to use this redemptively. And then he says, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And that sounds, isn't that a sweet thing? Your desire will be for your husband. But that's not what the Hebrew word means. The Hebrew word there means the desire to control. Every daughter of Eve will find within herself this desire to get him to do what I know he ought to do. And he even told me he should do this. Why isn't he doing this? You're going to find this urge within you to control. And it's not just limited to a husband. You will find this with your sons and with your daughters. You will find this with people around you, your in-laws, maybe people at work. This desire to control your world, control the people. Your desire will be for your husband, the desire to control, and he will rule over you, simply means it's not going to work. It's going to seem like it should work. It ought to work. Why doesn't he listen to me? He even agrees with me. And yet, in the pursuit of trying to get this knucklehead to do what you know he ought to do, it's actually going to make things worse. We end up resisting people who are trying to control us or manipulate us, or it appears that we're not acceptable to them until we do something. And we all naturally resist that. And that's what God is telling Eve here, and every daughter of Eve. Now, when I take these 2 things together, the children part, the husband part, it's not just those are applications, but the principle is true with people in general. We are going to have painful relationships, and at the same time, we are going to want to control our world. And to some extent, God is saying, oh, no, no, no. I am not going to let you do that. This is truly a bad idea. Now, it's not to say that there's an element of control that's important. There is an element of control regarding responsibilities. There's an element of control about me. But in trying to control my world outside of me, this is the danger zone. And God is saying, I am not going to let you do that, because that is a really bad idea for you and for the people in your life. On the inside of your handout, I'd like to look at the story of Hannah, because here is illustrated this very thing that we're talking about this morning, about glad surrender and the loss of control. We start in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 2. And here is she's going to experience 4 unexpected, painful things. And the first is the unexpected pain in her marriage. Verse 2, Elkanah, her husband, had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, Hannah had none. Now, when people first read this, they think, oh yeah, there was polygamy in the Old Testament. And I guess that makes it hunky-dory. But polygamy is not hunky-dory. Polygamy is a violation of the scriptures on marriage. This is truly a bad idea. And Elkanah and those who've done this eventually find this very painful thing out. I've never met a wife who thinks it's a good idea to have another one involved with her husband. Maybe there's some out there, and maybe for a short bit of time that may make sense to her. But eventually you run into your very self. You hunger for a kind of security with one man that knows you and loves you and is committed to you only. And when you add a second person into this, a second wife into this, you end up with rivalry and competition and envy and questions of, is this fair? Is this fair? And back and forth. This is truly a bad idea. And Hannah found herself once married to Elkanah. And now he comes home and he says, we've got wife number 2. Unexpected pain number 1. And then verse 5. But to Hannah he gave a double portion. This is when they went to worship, and they would slaughter an animal and give the animal for worship. He gave Hannah a double portion of meat to sacrifice because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Here's unexpected pain number 2. She's not just dealing with a second wife. That's unexpected 1. Unexpected 2, she's infertile. Now today we have situations that can remedy that in many cases. And we're happy about that. But in this particular case, as she thought about this, she could see her rival, as the scripture says, was having children. And she was not. And that said that the plumbing for the husband apparently was working. But the problem lay with her. What she may not have known is that the Lord, here it says, the Lord had closed her womb. Verse 6, we come to unexpected pain number 3. Because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. So here is somebody who's living in her house that every day is turning the knife in her and needling her about her inability to have a child. It's not just painful enough to not be able to have a child when you want one, but then to have this person who's with you every day taking this needle or this knife and twisting it in you. The scriptures record that she kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. It's a situation that God could have remedied. He could have spoken to the other wife. But this was a situation that she had to live with, apparently, as time went on. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. till she wept and would not eat. That's unexpected number 3. Unexpected number 4, we circle back to her husband. And when I think about her husband here, I would say he tried. And on my tombstone, if I end up having a tombstone, one of the things you can etch on there is, at least he tried. I will live with that. I will live with that. And that's sort of how I read between the lines here with her husband. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, again, when she's weeping and crying, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Now, most women would say, you don't know why? Now, in my experience in talking with women, sometimes you ladies don't know why you're crying. And if you don't know why you're crying, guess what? We probably don't know either. Now, to give him a little credit, she had multiple reasons to be crying at this point. And so to guess why was kind of a roll of the dice for him. At least he tries. And this is why, by asking these questions, he's trying to understand. But then he goes into that realm of fix it. I've never met a wife that likes to be fixed by her husband. He asked, don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? And that made sense to him to ask that question. And he meant well. He was trying to help her with her perspective. But again, no woman wants to be fixed like in this. She wants to be understood. So here are 4 unexpected, painful things over a period of several years that are going on with her. None of these things are allowing her to control her world. Her world and these 4 important things are out of her control. And God uses this back road redemptively in our lives, just like we'll see with Hannah. Verse 10, the story continues. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. Now, bitterness is the thing that happens when there's something we believe we need for our deepest needs to be met, and somebody won't meet that need. It can be a husband, it can be children, it can be a boss, it can be work, it can be in-laws. There are lots of people it could be. But as long as I'm hanging on to somebody must meet my need, and they don't, eventually I am going to become bitter. And so this arises in her. I think of this as a light on the dashboard to awaken her. What's going on down in my soul? In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much. She did have reasons to weep, good tears. And she had reasons at this point to weep bad tears of self-pity. And then it says, and she prayed to the Lord. And it's at this moment, if you could freeze this story, if you could hit the pause button, something happens while she's praying that begins to change her. Verse 11, she made a vow saying, O Lord Almighty, if you only look upon your servant's misery, not just that you will look upon my misery, but there's something different. Your servant's misery, and remember me and not forget your servant. Instead of putting herself at the top of the class and God needs to do this, she is submitting herself to God to be his servant in however he sees fit. This starts to change her very understanding of what's going on with her life. Not forget your servant, but give her a son. I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. So she sees the possibility of having a child, not just for her benefit or not even for the son's benefit or wanting to be a mother. These are good longings. But that this storyline involves something beyond just me and motherhood. It involves something of God and a son that if God chooses to give, there's something different, something significant here, a part of this story. She begins to, these things start to become a little bit clear to her. I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. No razor will be used on his head. And this is a picture of becoming a priest, an Old Testament priest. And she can see this vision, that this is a possibility, and she submits herself to God, sort of a glad surrender of her desires here to God. Verse 13. As the story continues, while she's praying, she is praying very fervently and very emotionally passionately in a good way. And Eli, who's the priest, observes her at a distance, and he thinks that she's had too much to drink. Kind of the clueless male here with the priest. And he walks over to her and asks her if she's been drinking. To her credit, she responds this way. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. I am a woman who is deeply troubled, she tells Eli. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. And that's really, really important in this story. She took the things that were the unexpected pains in her life, and she brought each one of them to God and poured out her soul to him. Been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. And then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Something had happened in her soul, down in her heart. We might say she had done business with God about who is really in control of her life, the circumstance of her life, the storyline of her life. And there's something in her that surrenders that then has an effect on her countenance. The writer says her face was no longer downcast. Now, you may have heard that particular phrase before, earlier in Genesis 4, after Cain killed Abel. Cain was completely unremorseful about what he had done. And God comes to Cain and confronts him about this. And Cain is quite belligerent and quite stubborn. And the question that God asked Cain to try to help him actively pull him out of this, he says, why is your face downcast? It's a rhetorical question. But it's the same idea here that's happening with Hannah. Why is your face downcast? If you will do right, won't your face be turned upwards? But if you continue down the road you're going to down, sin is crouching at your door and it desires to devour you. That's what God tells Cain. But the same imagery here is that something goes on in the heart that eventually has an effect on our countenance. Her face was no longer downcast. Verse 19. Early the next morning they arose and worshiped, including Hannah, before the Lord, and went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, which in Hebrew means, because I asked the Lord for him. So she's now pregnant, and she has a son. And the question is, what's she going to do with that boy? Is she going to renege on her promise? Is she going to say, now I've got what I want. Now I'm a mama. I've got a son. Now I'm going to throw all my Easter eggs of significance and importance in that child and being a mama. That's not what she does. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull for worship, they brought the boy to Eli. And she said to him, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. She's not reneging on her commitment. She has discovered from the time that she was at this time a year before until now that glad surrender is the best thing that she could do. She has surrendered to God's story for her and for her son. And he worshiped there. Joyful surrender of herself, joyful surrender of her son. And remember, this happened before she knew she was pregnant. Before she knew she was pregnant. She experienced joy number 4, that of glad surrender. Now, the rest of the story is really cool. We really usually, when we do child dedication, I don't go into the rest of the story. But during the course of her time before this episode, this painful episode of the four unexpecteds, she had some significant background of understanding of who God was. And it sort of crystallized for her after this experience with having a child and bringing him to the next few years until he was weaned. And in chapter 2, she writes, she prays this, and thankfully we have this written for us. But listen to her soul. My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high. Horn in the Old Testament means my strength. It's like the rhinoceros. The horn is the strength, or the tusk for the elephant. My horn is my strength. She's saying the Lord is my strength. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. It's a different kind of joy. She rejoices, there's a word, and then uses the word delight. Verse 2, there is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. In other words, she looks back on her experience of the four unexpected things, and in spite of how painful they were, she can now see, after the effect, that God was holy in all of this endeavor, allowing these things to happen redemptively in her life. For her, her son, who was to be a priest, and for all of us who hear her story. Do not keep talking so proudly, she writes, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, and those who were hungry hunger no more. In other words, she sees God is not just a part of her story, but it's trying to tell a story in everybody's life. And she has several examples here of those who don't think they need God, and their life is just going swimmingly, but eventually not so much. And then she sees on the other side people like herself who have those unexpected, painful things, and life is not going well, and yet God uses that redemptively in their lives, like her. Those who are full hire themselves out for food. Those who were hungry hunger no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children. But she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles, he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's, upon them he has set the world. You see what she's understanding? That God is telling a story. And he's able to tell the story not just in a general way, but with individual people, just like herself. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked will be silenced in darkness. And then I love this, what she says next. It is not by strength that one prevails. It is not by strength that one prevails. It is not by human strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed, the strength of his anointed, which we take to be the Messiah someday. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. When I was the oldest in my family, and when I drove off to college, my mother was out on the curb, and she was crying like a baby. My son's going to be a doctor, and he's going off to college. And she was just, it was just like, and there's a place for that. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But Hannah let her son go when he was about 3. You imagine doing that? I have a 3-year-old granddaughter. I have a 4-year-old granddaughter. I find that pretty amazing that she could do that. She was committed to God's story. She had experienced God's story, the wisdom of the story. And she was going to stay on that story no matter what. Let's pray together. Father, these back roads to joy are so unintuitive to us. And oftentimes when they happen, we are kicking and screaming inside, if not outside. And yet you are using these things, and here today, these unexpected things we never imagined would happen to us. You are using these redemptively to help us to loosen our tight grip on control. We have to have things the way they are. People have to do things the way we want them to do. People need to relate to me in a way that makes sense to me and meets my needs. And along the way, of course, we never see that produces misery. But along the way, this requires a back road where we open up our fist, our tight fist of control, and yield ourselves to you. Yield ourselves to a greater story that you're telling with our life, even than we happen to be aware of at the moment. And you want us to experience a kind of joy down in our gut, in our heart, that we usually call peace. I can be at peace, even when things are unexpected, and I don't know how they're going to play out. The most important thing I can do is to gladly surrender myself to you. And Father, this is something that you take all of us through at different seasons of our life. And if there are some Hannahs watching, or Mr. Hannahs watching today or here today, and you're dealing with them, would you help them to loosen their grip on what they think and have thought all their life they need to have, and that's control. Would you invite them to surrender themselves to you, the God who loves us and gave his own son to die for us? We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.